From the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored, this is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
The whole idea of a Reagan presidency, I think Meyer came up with that before Ronald Reagan did. And of course, that came about after his death. So he really laid the seeds for a lot of good things that happened for conservatives. He just didn't live long enough to enjoy them.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was Daniel J. Flynn, author of the new book, The Man Who Invented Conservatism, The Unlikely Life of Frank S. Meyer. We'll talk with Daniel in depth about that book coming up later on today's program. First, we're joined by Dr. Jonathan Gregg. He is Assistant Professor of Education at Hillsdale College, Project Director of the Archimedes Standards. Dr. Gregg, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Talking today about an essay you co-wrote with David Randall over at realcleareducation.com, The Alarming Decay of Mathematical Competency in America. Why should everyday Americans, parents, taxpayers, even those people without kids in school, why should we care about math standards?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think on the surface, there's very little reason to care about math standards. We don't see them show up in our everyday lives. We don't see them. We probably don't even know what they say. But I think the real issue is that math standards lie upstream from so many things that we actually do care about, where certainly they lie upstream of things like curriculum, which people do start to see showing up in their homes, and their students bring home math problems. It lies upstream of certainly achievement, pedagogy, but even just the kinds of things that show up in our everyday lives. Like, for example, I was at the bank a few days ago, and the teller had a hard time counting out $150 for my cash back. And we all have stories like this. And you don't really trace that back to math standards until maybe you take a look at the math standards and the fact that counting and learning about money is only mentioned one time in the state standards, and it's not until third grade. And then you start to say, well, why do we have some of this failures in our everyday mathematical literacy? Well, it's probably due to the fact that these standards have been written in such a way that it's going to encourage that. And you see, I think standards are this kind of black box that a lot of people don't understand actually has a tremendous amount of impact, where the standards process is shrouded in mystery and you don't have direct influence over that process. And yet so many times when you talk to school leaders or teachers, they kind of say, well, my hands are tied. These are just the standards that I'm working with. And so I do think sometimes the way to fix problems that are downstream is actually to go all the way upstream and fix the thing that's causing, or at least is impacting the problems that you're seeing. Go to it's the kind of symptoms versus actual root causes. Right. Standards tend to be some of the root causes of some of the symptoms that we see.
In this essay, you're critical of the Common Core math standards. What, in your view, were the biggest missteps there?
Yeah, there's a lot. On the surface, they look pretty harmless, where, it's not like they're missing fractions entirely, right? It's not there are a lot of good things present in the Common Core math standards. I think a couple of the big mistakes, number one, and probably primarily, they're very hard to understand, especially when it comes to two of the key stakeholders in this project, teachers and parents. I think the average parent is going to read some of the Common Core standards and not understand them. Thinking of one that says, subtract multiples of 10 to 90 in the range of 10 to 90, excluding zeros and 10. And it just goes on like this, and you start to not really even know what it's asking you to do. And so I think this is really problematic because parents can't really hold teachers accountable or schools accountable, and they don't understand what their students are supposed to be learning. And even teachers, especially young teachers, especially what we might call pre-service teachers who are just entering the profession, or early career teachers who are in their first couple of years in the profession, have a really hard time understanding what those standards are saying. And so I think if they're unintelligible, that's problematic, because these are some of the things that should unite us. They should bring us together to say, parents, teachers, administrators, policymakers, we should all be on the same page when it comes to what we want our students to learn. And I think the Common Core standards are maybe not intentionally obscure, but they haven't gone out of their way to make themselves understandable. I think the second one, I already mentioned things like money, but these are or maybe I'll say it this way, they're a little light on some of the basic fundamental knowledge that students really need to know, especially in the early grades, where money doesn't show up until third grade, where in reality, money should be a kindergarten standard, where they're not going to be counting out money and making change, but they should be recognizing U.S. coins in kindergarten. And we don't see money until third grade at all. We don't see things like reducing fractions. We don't see things like memorizing your math facts. I think we do see those, but they're pushed into later grades rather than forefronted. You learn a lot of standards about length without ever seeing a ruler, and some of these types of things that are they run counterintuitive to the way that we actually learn, and they don't equip the students with the tools they need to think. The Common Core standards are famously high on thinking and high on reasoning and drawing, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. But students need tools to do those things. They need their math facts. They need to know what a ruler is. They need to know and I think money is just such a really great example, because if you're thinking, and I'm going to get a little technical here, but if you're thinking about learning place value, about regrouping ones into tens into hundreds, that's a hard concept for a first or second grader to learn. But what's their best access point to that? What's the thing that they most are familiar with, where you do regroup things? And it's money, right? You trade. I mean, first graders do know that you can trade 4 quarters for $1, right? Or that's the most tangible access point. That's the tool that they need to understand this concept called place value, and to push money off and then expect students to understand place value is just counterproductive. It's counterintuitive. And so I think there's some serious holes in the Common Core math standards conceptually as well.
Jonathan Gregg with us, his piece at realcleareducation.com, The Alarming Decay of Mathematical Competency in America. You point out the drop in American performance on international math assessments. What are the top performing countries doing differently?
Yeah, really good question. And I think some history here is necessary, where it's been 15 or so years since the Common Core standards have been adopted, and we have seen zero growth in performance. And it's been 20 or 25 years since we've been doing things like this, where we've seen the United States falling behind. And what's even more alarming is that if you look at the list of developed countries, the U.S. sits kind of in the middle, which you think, okay, well, we're in the middle. Not great, but not horrible. But then you look at the spending that we do on education, and the United States is second to only Luxembourg, which has a GDP of, I don't know, $75 quadrillion. And so we spend more than any of these other countries on education, and yet we're seeing no difference. And I think a lot of that can be traced back to some of these standards, where if you're spending it in the wrong ways and in the wrong places, you're not going to see those kind of results, just because you're trying to pour money into a little bit of a broken system. So I don't think other countries are spending more than we are. I think they have a culture in which some of these basic tools are being put into kids' hands at an early age. I'm thinking of particularly in countries like Singapore, where a lot of times in the home there's a culture of memorizing math facts, and they show up to their classes with those math facts already memorized. And I think that's maybe never going to happen in America on the home front, but it can happen in our classrooms at an early age. And so for us to kind of push those tools away from students by pushing them back into later grades as far as standards go is pretty problematic. I think what you see is this in these countries that are doing well is this balance between conceptual understanding and procedural fluency, between knowing why things work and being able to memorize how they work. And so I think in the United States, we just don't have that same kind of balance. And it's really problematic when it comes to some of these internationally normed tests.
We hear somewhat of a louder concern about American high school students graduating and they can't read. Right, there are literacy problems. Don't necessarily hear that same outcry about math, although, as you point out, fewer American students are prepared for college math. We've talked, I think, a little bit about what's driving that, but what are the consequences, the ripple effects for those students and in the future, our workforce?
Yeah, great question. I think one of the things that is no one talks about, but there's a lot of research into, is just the kind of discouragement and dropout rates that we actually see from students especially in the community college scene, where you have students that show up to community college and they test into a math class that's not even credit bearing. So, you have to pass, say, college algebra, but they can't test into college algebra. And so then they have to take a class that, pay money at a community college to take this class that actually doesn't give them any credit. And so you can imagine, and then potentially you fail that class. Think about how discouraged you are at that point, where you're paying your money for this class that is, you're not even going to get credit for, and you're not even ready for that one. And so you see some of these dropout rates where math then becomes this gatekeeper course, that it is functioning as a gatekeeper course at that point. But it's because we haven't done the work to prepare students for classes like that. And so you start to see this discouragement where students maybe want to pursue a profession or want to pursue something like this, and they're barred from doing it. Or imagine you're trying to hire someone. I mean, imagine my bank story where you're trying to hire a qualified teller and you can't find someone who can make change. I mean, that's maybe an obvious story, but I do think you're going to start to see, and we're starting to see, more companies paying more money on training, more companies just not being able to hire students that are, or people that are ready for the jobs that we have here. And this isn't even getting into high tech jobs like, computer programming, et cetera, which we really are having to outsource a lot of those types of jobs. But these are just basic competence and literacy and thinking in mathematics that actually does matter, where it's not about whether you can solve for X, but whether you can think in a systematic, structured way, whether you can solve problems, whether you can identify extraneous information, whether you can ask the right kinds of questions. All of these are mathematical skills that students learn at an early age mathematically that really do start to have an impact in the workforce. And that's where we're starting to see some of the drop-offs.
We'll be back in a moment with Jonathan Gregg, and I want to make sure you know about the new Hillsdale College online course right now. It's called American Paintings. Your teacher is Sam Connect, Professor Emeritus of Art here at Hillsdale College. We talked to him last week on the show. You can hear him describe. It explores American paintings that present the American character and make us proud to be Americans, because great artists can see things that are difficult to capture, and then they portray it with a beauty that makes it easier for us to grasp. Whether you are a great appreciator of art or just a beginner, this is a fantastic course for you. American Paintings, hillsdale.edu/new course, NEWCOURSE. For American Paintings with Sam Connect, available now. hillsdale.edu/new course. We continue now with Jonathan Gregg. He's Assistant Professor of Education here at Hillsdale College, also the author of the recent piece, The Alarming Decay of Mathematical Competency in America, over at Real Clear Education, and the project director of the Archimedes Standards. Okay, what's that? The Archimedes Standards, what is it? What makes them different from what most states are using now?
Yeah, great question. I think we've tried to address some of the holes that I just mentioned in the Common Core state standards. And I think if you wanted to put one word on the Archimedes standards, or what I hope that they are, is maybe streamlined, where it cuts out some of the excess, it cuts out some of the diversions, and it creates this direct pathway where students can actually envision moving from concept to concept in a linear fashion, where they're not going to fall behind. They're not going to develop these holes because you've streamlined the process. One of the things that we did, and we had to fight actually for this, was just to operate under the principle that says if an average parent can't understand this, it's a bad standard, regardless of what it's trying to say. We have to make these things intelligible. We have to make these things understandable. And so I would challenge you, pick up your all of this. Your state standards are free online. They're public. Pick up your state standards, and then pick up the Archimedes standards, which is also free online. And compare them and see which one you can understand and which one you can't. I think we've tried to make these things. One of the things we did in the project was we tested it on some pre-service teachers, where these are juniors and seniors in college who want to go be elementary teachers. They don't have any extra teaching knowledge, but they want to be teachers. And to say, I have a friend who teaches at the university level, and one of the 3 credit courses that he teaches is called Disentangling the Standards. Why do we have a course like that? Why aren't the standards by themselves disentangled? Why don't we disentangle them for teachers? And so this has been one of the main features of the Archimedes standards, is to create things that are intelligible, that are clear, that you could actually use as a guide to a lesson plan, or that you could use as a parent to have a conversation with a teacher to say, look, here's the standard. I'm not seeing this from my kid. What can we do? How can we help my student to understand these things?
What do these Archimedes standards look like on a practical basis in the classroom for perhaps a 4th grader or a high schooler?
Yeah, good question. And I think again, you're not going to see the impact so as directly, right? These things lie upstream of curriculum and of pedagogy. But if you start to put yourself in the shoes of a curriculum developer, where instead of trying to figure out these complex ways of trying to get students to think without using some of the tools of thinking, but now you're writing a textbook that has a very clear set of standards: multiply and divide numbers to 1,000. Oh, that's something that I might be able to write a clear curriculum about. And then you have a teacher who's saying, okay, well, I can enact this in the classroom. Here's my clear objective for the day. And so I think what you're going to see from a student's perspective is just more intelligibility with what they're trying to learn, that they know what's coming down the pike, that they have, that they're saying, oh, well, this is a clear progression from here to here. Oh, I'm using this tool that I learned last year now in this year. And I think you're going to see them be able to develop that conceptual understanding because things are clearer. And I think we all, at least a lot of us, know the moment that we gave up on mathematics, right? And it's mostly because something felt like magic and you didn't understand it. And you said, okay, well, I give up. I will continue to try to get right answers because I know that's going to be, I want to get a good grade or I want to get into college, et cetera, but I'm out. And I think a streamlined, clear set of standards is going to start to do is it's going to minimize some of those moments. It's going to say, oh, there aren't these moments where math has to just feel like magic. This is going to be a clear progression from one grade to another, and where you're actually building a solid foundation and then you're stacking blocks one after the other. You're not trying to put a roof on before you have the walls, and you just say, well, I can't put this roof on, and you give up. I would give up as well. And so I think in practice, it's going to start to minimize some of those moments.
Changing state standards sounds like a heavy lift, particularly in the wake of the backlash against Common Core. How do you see the Archimedes standards gaining traction?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. One bright spot is that states do periodically have to go through a review of their curriculum and a review of their standards. And so every 5-ish years, states are going to have to take up their math standards. And so there's going to be a moment in each state's, and most of the time what the states will try to do is just to kind of tinker around with a few changes on the edges and keep everything the same, where actually this may surprise a number of you, but Common Core was adopted by almost every state. And then a lot of, especially some of the Republican states in the union, have quote unquote repealed Common Core. And what that looks like is actually doing very little. If you compare, I've been working with Louisiana for the past few weeks in their review process. It's their time. And so we've been working with Louisiana, trying to get them to adopt a set of standards that are a little clearer. And Louisiana adopted this Common Core in 2011 and then repealed it in 2016. And if you compare their standards to Common Core standards, they are word for word identical. So they called them the Louisiana standards, but really they're just Common Core in disguise. And so parents think, oh yeah, we repealed Common Core 10 years ago. And no, really 41 states still have some sort of version of the Common Core standards on their books. And so I think the fact, first of all, just raising some awareness that what you have is probably Common Core in disguise. And then to say, look, this is going to happen every 5 years. I don't want to say call your Congress people, but pick up the standards and say, and they have to actually give the standards to the public to invite commentary. And when that happens, I think trying to say, look, I don't understand this standard. I don't understand this standard, and hold them accountable and say, this standard needs to be something that I need where it's going to be, that I need to be able to understand, where I think this is going to be driven by teachers and parents. If there's going to be some change, it's not going to be driven by your policymakers. It's going to be driven by people who say, look, I need to be able to understand these standards, and I don't understand some of these. I think what's going to happen eventually, hopefully what happens is a few states will take the plunge and everyone will start to see, oh, look, so we've been working with Louisiana. I'm not sure what they're going to end up choosing, but we need a few states to take the plunge and say, this is enough is enough. We need it's been 15 years of no progress. Let's try to get something that's a little bit better here. And I think once, education is funny, where once something gets some momentum, it can pick up. So I'm not unhopeful here.
If that happens, if the reforms succeed with the Archimedes standards, what do you hope that math education in the U.S. looks like, say, 10 years from now?
One of the big ones is just students' love of mathematics. That I think a lot of times math, I even get a bunch of students here at Hillsdale that say, I'm just not a math person. I've never really loved math. And I'm not surprised, where the way in which we teach math is particularly obscure, and there's no clarity to it. And so I think you start to see people, really good students even, gravitating towards some of these other disciplines, and rightfully so, because math hasn't been presented as something that's clear, as something that makes sense, as something that's beautiful, as something that's even just doable. And so you get these people who say, I'm not math people. And really that type of attitude starts to catch on. And then math just becomes this almost a curse word, right? And so I think my real hope would be for math to start to be a thing that students start to love again. You may say, well, the connection from standards to love is not direct, and I agree it's not. But I do think that when you start to connect some of these dots, you want to trace it back as far as you can, and at the very least, you could have good standards and not have love of math in the classroom. Absolutely. But shouldn't we at least give our best shot at putting the best standards that we can out there that is going to equip teachers to teach in a way that's going to inspire their students?
Dr. Jonathan Gregg is Assistant Professor of Education at Hillsdale College and Project Director of the Archimedes Standards. You can read more at realcleareducation.com. He's with David Randall, The Alarming Decay of Mathematical Competency in America. Dr. Gregg, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. When we return, Daniel J. Flynn joins us. We'll talk about his new book about Frank S. Meyer, the man who invented conservatism. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to check out the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. Find all of our programs at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio, including YouTube. We're joined by Daniel J. Flynn. He's senior editor at the American Spectator, Hoover Institution visiting fellow, and the author of the new book, The Man Who Invented Conservatism, The Unlikely Life of Frank S. Meyer. Daniel, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So we got to give a brief introduction for listeners who might not be familiar at all with our topic today. Who was Frank S. Meyer briefly? Why does he matter?
Frank Meyer was a communist who later turned against his former comrades in the longest, most expensive trial in the history of the United States up until that point in 1949. Became a conservative shortly thereafter. And in 1955, he was president at the creation of National Review. in National Review and also in the book In Defense of Freedom, that's sort of where he makes his biggest impact. And I guess the thumbnail sketch ends with him dying in 1972.
In the introduction for The Man Who Invented Conservatism, you make this distinction between Meyer thinking maybe he had to invent conservatism versus eventually, as you describe it, developing a philosophy. Tell us about that delineation and perhaps the state of conservatism as Frank Meyer is beginning to develop this philosophy.
Sure. Meyer came from the left, and the left is all about systems. So I think when he came over to the right, he thought, well, we need to have a system to combat that other system. And he didn't realize that that was, antithetical to conservatism. So initially, he thought, someone has to invent conservatism. Conservatism develops organically. And I think ultimately that's what Meyer discovered. That's where his intellectual journey took him. The philosophy that he helped develop was something called fusionism. And what fusionism was essentially was a joining together of traditionalism and freedom, of libertarians and traditionalists. And the way this was done is, well, if you're a conservative in England, you might conserve the monarchy or the aristocracy or fox hunts. If you're a conservative in America, the thing that you conserve is the American founding. That's what's unique about this country. And what the founding means is freedom. So the tradition of America is the founding, and what the founding means is freedom. Stan Evans, one of Frank's acolytes, put it on the cover of a book in the mid-1990s called The Theme is Freedom. And in that book, he basically said, freedom rests upon thousands of years of Western civilization, of the traditions of Western civilization. And if you take that away, you're going to lose freedom pretty quickly. And so that way, freedom and tradition, they weren't in conflict, they were in cooperation.
This book, The Man Who Invented Conservatism, is a look at the life of Frank Meyer. And you mentioned at the top, he's a communist early on. And in fact, he's an American communist in Britain at Oxford after leaving Princeton. What's life like for him in that situation?
Well, I think it's great for Frank in England. His England years were great. I mean, one of the things that he was doing, if you're a communist, you're not a Boy Scout. Even if you become a conservative decades later, you're not a Boy Scout. And so one of the things he was doing while he was advocating the violent overthrow of the British government was dating the prime minister's daughter. He was dating Ramsay MacDonald's youngest daughter. In fact, I have a letter from her inviting him to come over to 10 Downing Street because her father is not there. Now, if you're a communist looking for revolution, it's probably a bad idea to date the prime minister's daughter. It's a bad idea to date the leader of the country's daughter. And so, unsurprisingly, Frank found himself deported in 1934. And probably unsurprisingly, Sheila MacDonald, Ramsay MacDonald's youngest daughter, she said, Frank, can I do anything to intervene? Well, she couldn't really do anything to intervene. And she may have very well been the cause of his deportation.
Talking with Daniel J. Flynn. His new book is On the Unlikely Life of Frank S. Meyer. Thought of as an ideas guy, father of fusionism. Something that comes through in The Man Who Invented Conservatism is that he's a really effective organizer. He's a guy who sort of radiates energy and not just ideas. How do we see that sort of come through in his life?
Well, the amazing thing, when I looked at the files of the British intelligence, the declassified files on Frank Meyer, and I have about 161 pages of that, he's described as the founder of the Communist Party movement among the university students in England. And that's a strange thing for an American. He really Johnny Appleseeded communism over there. In Oxford, they went from 0 communist student presence to over 300 in a few short years because of Frank Meyer. And so he changed his views. He eventually became a conservative, but you don't change your personality. And that same magnetic, electric personality that was, compelling the prime minister's daughter into his arms, that's the same type of energy that people are attracted to in mass movements. And so, one of the things, I have a letter, shocking letter that I found that from a guy who was an anonymous prep school teacher in Pennsylvania. And he said, I basically begging to drink with Frank again, saying, I want to take a Cook's tour of this part of the country with you, that Frank, he remembers the scintillating conversations with Frank, and his life is an intellectual desert without those conversations. That was James Michener. That wasn't James Michener when he wasn't famous, before he wrote Tales of the South Pacific. And so time and again, whether it's the Prime Minister's daughter, whether it's James Michener, doesn't matter who it is, people were attracted to this guy. He had a charisma, he had an energy. And so when he was on the right, he naturally was the guy that was good. People were going to follow. He's like I said, he's president at the creation of National Review, at the Conservative Party of New York. He's a founder of the American Conservative Union. He is one of the founders of the Philadelphia Society. He's at the founding meeting of Young Americans for Freedom. So all over the skeletal structure of the American right, there is the fingerprints of Frank Meyer.
Daniel, this pivot to conservatism has to happen at some point. If I'm reading the book correctly, that time happens during his stint in the Army, where he comes from a wealthy family, he's somewhat insulated, and he all of a sudden he meets these working class boys, working class young men. How did that change him?
Well, I think it changed him because for the first time in his life, here's a guy who lived in a high-hat hotel in Newark, New Jersey. His father had a very successful business. His mother came from money. He went to private schools, went to Balliol College in England, arguably the most highfalutin college on the planet. And he finally meets the proletariat that Marx had been talking about. And he looks at them and says, well, these aren't the guys Marx was talking about. They're very different. And so this pushes him away from communism. Later, he reviews a book for the new masses during a time when communism, there was a short year and a half or so where there was this very free period within communism, when they were allies of the United States towards the end of the Second World War. And Meyer writes a almost positive review of The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek. That book changes his life. And so does the fact that the communists start to realize that he's no good. He's no longer a good communist. They go to his wife, Elsie, and say, well, we think you're a good communist, but Frank isn't. You need to divorce Frank and stay in the Communist Party. And this frightens her because Frank and her are very close. And so at that point, they just decide to get out of Dodge. They after 14 years in the Communist Party for Frank and about 10 years for Elsie, 10 or 11 years, they decide they don't want that any longer.
Talking with Daniel J. Flynn, the author of The Man Who Invented Conservatism, The Unlikely Life of Frank S. Meyer. Kind of pause for a moment here because there's all sorts of stuff in this book that has not been seen before, because you've seen things that hadn't been seen before, boxes of letters and notes that you opened that had not been seen in decades. Tell us briefly the story about how that happened and what you think perhaps you were able to glean from that information about his character, his relationships that perhaps we didn't know before.
Well, most of the things I'm telling you come from those boxes, and I think that's what makes the book so special. There are so many books that rely on other books as sources. This one relies on material that nobody has seen before. And after about 2 years of searching, in August of 2022, I found Frank Meyer's papers in the back of a warehouse in Altoona, Pennsylvania. And it took me about 19 months to go through all of those documents, to take notes on the important stuff. There's letters in there from C.S. Lewis, from Tolkien, from Joan Didion. I have 1,000 letters from William F. Buckley, 1,000 letters from Wilmore Kendall nobody has seen before, 1,000 letters to and from Brent Bozell. It just goes on that, the founding fathers of the conservative movement, the post-war conservative movement, there are thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of letters from these people that haven't been seen since they were sent and read. And so I think that's what makes this book so very special, that you're going to get information that you don't get anywhere else. I mean, just to take an example, Meyer was very close with Brent Bozell. And Brent Bozell, of course, ghost wrote The Conscience of a Conservative, the best-selling political book in U.S. history that Barry Goldwater wrote. So one year he writes that, and the next year he's writing to Meyer saying, I think Goldwater has become our Frankenstein. And they're comparing Barry Goldwater to a monster that they've created. And they're wondering how, he might take conservatism in the wrong direction. And they're very worried about this kind of thing. I don't think that was known before this. I mean, that Goldwater was kind of a prickly personality, and people knew that he had fights with various people. But the fact that there were these misgivings from Meyer, from Bill Rusher, from Brent Bozell, from all of these people in National Review who've been heretofore thought of as his amen corner, I think that those documents are going to be, I think for a lot of people, that's going to be shocking.
After years as a communist, how did Meyer begin to ingratiate himself with the right, with conservatives, and I guess convince them that he was now one of them?
Well, I think you got to this a little bit in your question before, and you asked about the state of the conservative movement.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there really wasn't much of a conservative movement after the Second World War. If you remember, Russell Kirk was originally going to title his book, The Conservative Mind, The Conservative Rout, because they had been so routed. And there were remnants of that old right, like Rose Wilder Lane or Garrett Garrett, John T. Flynn. But those people had been thoroughly defeated. And so it almost sprang up from the ashes, the post-war conservative movement. And they had to figure out what it was that they stood for. What Meyer said years later was the unifying principle was they were all against the New Deal. They were all for restoration of what America was like prior to the New Deal. And I think that's, as far as a unifying principle, that probably described most of them. But then you started to get into sort of unique aspects of Russell Kirk, of Brent Bozell eventually becomes kind of a Catholic conservative. Russell Kirk is more of a traditionalist. You have libertarians like Murray Rothbard, and then Meyer sort of in the middle, fusing it all together with his ideas. So you had people that, it's strange as it sounds, conservatives who had to almost make conservatism anew. And so they were accepting of all kinds. They were sort of desperate. And the movement was filled with a lot of ex-communists, people like Whittaker Chambers, James Burnham, who's a guy that Meyer clashed with severely at National Review. He would be another big shot in that early conservative movement. Almost all of the people in early National Review, with the exception of William F. Buckley, found themselves on the left at one time or another in their life. Such was the state of the movement that they were willing to sort of accept all comers. And in fact, if you look at conservatives today, the moment someone from the left sort of says something nice about conservatives, you take like Bill Maher or someone like that, conservatives start going wild over that person. I think because they have an inferiority complex, and they certainly had one at that point.
Meyer has a focus on uniting people and uniting ideas, too, going back to the 30s, as you point out, this 20th century Americanism, which encompasses the communism of that time. As we get to this point, there are so many people around Meyer with sharp, hardened positions, Kendall, Bozell, Buckley, Kirk, and others. How was he able to fuse those men together at a time that there were so many spirited debates among them?
Uneasily, and ultimately with some of these people he could not. It's remarkable the number of people that he remained friends with. And if you look at his debates with Brent Bozell in National Review, you would think that these guys are enemies. Same with his debates with Harry Jaffa. Well, my correspondence shows that they're friends. They're sort of laughing about this behind the scenes. In fact, Brent Bozell writes him, I'm going to write you I'm going to excommunicate you from the conservative movement, and I'm going to do it in National Review. I'm going to create the biggest stink that this movement has seen. And they're laughing about this. And he's saying, listen, if Bill Buckley doesn't put it in the magazine, I'm going to resign. So why don't we just put it in while Bill's out skiing in Switzerland? And they're, again, they're joking about this kind of thing. But if you would just read the articles in the magazine, you'd think that they hate each other. In certain cases, Meyer couldn't keep it together. A guy like Wilmore Kendall, who was Buckley's teacher at Yale, Buckley's mentor, had such a difficult, nowadays you'd say the guy had a personality disorder. He had such a difficult personality that eventually he just sort of wrote everyone out of his life, to include Meyer. There's a letter in there. It's rather, it's shocking in a sense, but knowing Kendall's personality, it's not so shocking, where he says essentially to Meyer and to Elsie Meyer, your claim that I'm having a fight with all my friends is false. The only friend I currently have a fight with is Frank Meyer. If you're saying that William F. Buckley, he is my friend, nobody has heard me call him my friend for at least 5 years. This is really the routine, resumption of hostilities between enemies. He is my enemy. That's pretty shocking because, Buckley carried this guy under his wing. Kendall's stuff in the book is shocking throughout. There's at one point he writes Meyer and says, I don't have the book review that you had requested, and I'm sorry, I don't have a good excuse at this point. Remember that 19-year-old co-ed I told you about? Well, she showed up at my door again, and this time I didn't turn her away. In other words, some of these guys were leading a very madman existence, and Kendall foremost among them. I mean, this at the time was a 50-something-year-old man, and he's talking about messing around with a 19-year-old college student. He writes Meyer at another point and says, basically that he's on a health kick, that he has quit his usual intake of 70 cigarettes a day, and now he's just smoking a pack a day. And that was his idea of health. So a lot of these guys led really wild lives. And it's no shock that Kendall led a really wild life, but I think there's great specificity in this book that you're not going to get anywhere else, because here is Kendall writing not to Bill Buckley, his boss. He's writing to his friend, Frank Meyer, and there's a greater degree of honesty in these 1,000 letters that I have between between Kendall and Meyer that nobody has ever seen before.
Talking with Daniel J. Flynn. His book is The Man Who Invented Conservatism, The Unlikely Life of Frank S. Meyer. Meyer's 1962 book, In Defense of Freedom. Great line from the introduction, which is repeated from Brian Eno, talking about the Velvet Underground and Nico album. Didn't sell, but everyone who bought that album started a band. Well, Meyer's book sold around 3,000 copies, but apparently, as you say, everyone who bought one ran for office, started a movement of some sort, maybe a magazine. What was In Defense of Freedom all about? Why did it become so influential?
Well, I think because it was very simple to understand. It was short. And I think what he said was true. And so we talked about fusionism earlier, but he sort of expanded on that. He talked about government having three functions, and those functions essentially being police powers, judiciary powers to adjudicate disputes, and to defend the country against foreign enemies. And anything beyond that was beyond the scope of what we should grant the federal government. So for someone that was mistrusting of government, as Meyer was, this was his manifesto. One of the books that Meyer was a huge Tolkien fan. Mm-hmm. And if you read Tolkien, or even if you watch the movies, the whole concept of the ring, for Meyer, it didn't matter if Gollum was wearing that ring or if Gandhi was wearing that ring. You shouldn't concentrate power. You shouldn't concentrate power in just one individual or even a few individuals. And I think those are a few of the messages that you get from reading In Defense of Freedom. I also think that it has staying power because it had a much more practical political value than, say, The Conservative Mind or Ideas Have Consequences or other classic conservative books. This book, In Defense of Freedom, was a lot more applicable to political affairs. And I think that's one of the reasons why, yes, in its first 10 years, it sold 3,000 copies. But after that, it took on a new life through Regnery Gateway editions, through the Liberty Fund put out a new printing in the 1990s. So most of its copies sold well after Meyer had died.
Talk a little bit about Goldwater, but in the post-Goldwater years, you say that Frank Meyer's great beast humbled, wounded, but it survived. That which didn't kill it made it stronger. This idea of fusionism, which would go on to live another day, why did it when voters saw some of it and thoroughly rejected it at the ballot box?
Yeah, Goldwater lost. He got trounced in 1964. Meyer, a couple months before the election, he was predicting, possibly there could be a Goldwater landslide. Well, there was a landslide. It just went the other way. So at times he could confuse his wish for, reality. And at least for short-term predictions, he didn't always make for the best prognosticator. You referenced the great beast. Lyndon Johnson was smart enough to know that there was something powerful in American politics. He called it the great beast. And what he meant was American conservatism, that it would come up and roar up after its defeat. Meyer instinctively knew that. And I think Lyndon Johnson knew that as well. That's why he called it the great beast. Meyer nursed the great beast back to health. And so you had all of these organizations in that year, 1964, and after it, springing up, like the Philadelphia Society, like the American Conservative Union, and creating this infrastructure for conservatives to be more effective with their ideas. And so by 1966, you had not only Ronald Reagan winning, but you had Republicans winning in a landslide in the midterm elections in Washington. And so all of a sudden you have this comeback. And from 1966 all the way into the 1990s, the conservatives increasingly run things. They run the federal government, they run the states, and they make such massive gains. Unfortunately for Frank Meyer, the guy who was, almost more than anyone else was responsible for this, at least as an idea man, he dies before he can see much of it come to fruition.
Much of it comes to fruition in the form of Ronald Reagan. And as you write in The Man Who Invented Conservatism, Meyer was a fan. Wrote an essay in the New Republic, Why I Am for Reagan, in 1964, spotlighted him as the Republican future in December of 1964. What did Meyer see in Reagan, and did Reagan in his presidency and end up fulfilling some of his what he thought he could be?
The last question, I think definitely. I mean, Reagan very much was sort of the embodiment of Meyer's fusionist dreams. And in fact, in 1960, we talked about Meyer having short-term being a bad prognosticator. Long-term, he was very good. And in 1960, he wrote a memo to his his colleagues at National Review and said, we must under no circumstances endorse Richard Nixon. We must under no circumstances endorse Nelson Rockefeller. It may take us 20 years to elect one of our own to the presidency. We may have to wait until 1980, unless there's a crisis or something before then. But it's likely that we wait until 1980 until elect one of our own. And so he basically predicted, what came to be. With Reagan, almost immediately when Goldwater lost, he pinpointed Reagan as the future of the Republican Party. And in fact, his colleagues at National Review, a couple of guys who were less political, Hugh Kenner and Guy Davenport, who were more literary. Kenner had written a rebuttal to a pro-Reagan piece by William F. Buckley that was published there in 1967, and he called it a nervous view of Ronald Reagan. When Meyer saw this, he besieged Buckley, we have to have a rebuttal, and Buckley agreed. And so Meyer engineered this rebuttal, which was sort of brutal, towards Kenner. And Kenner was maybe the most valuable guy in in Meyer's literary section of National Review. Mm-hmm. But he decided to quit, to resign because of what Meyer had engineered. Meyer was so tethered to Reagan at that point that he was willing to sacrifice his best contributor in Books, Arts, and Manners of National Review. And they were completely shocked. I mean, Guy Davenport said, with an exclamation point at the end, he said, Frank thinks that Reagan should be president of the USA. And of course, now that doesn't seem so shocking, but back then people viewed Ronald Reagan as an actor. Frank Meyer obviously saw something bigger in Reagan. And Reagan, about a decade after Meyer died at CPAC, the big political conservative conference, he gave a big speech in which he sort of gave nods to various conservative figures. And then he spent a long time talking about Frank Meyer and Meyer's contributions to conservatism. And that made for sort of a great 10-year delayed eulogy that I think was fitting for Meyer, because he had helped bring that moment about. The idea of CPAC, that was an idea that Meyer came up with in the 1960s. They started it after his death. The whole idea of a Reagan presidency, I think Meyer came up with that before Ronald Reagan did. And of course, that came about after his death. So he really laid the seeds for a lot of good things that happened for conservatives. He just didn't live long enough to enjoy them.
Daniel J. Flynn is the author of the book, The Man Who Invented Conservatism, The Unlikely Life of Frank S. Meyer. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Outstanding. I appreciate it.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Jonathan Gregg from Hillsdale's Education Department and Daniel J. Flynn. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio, and be sure to subscribe. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.